this meeting. So for those of you, if for some reason you need to leave a little early or you know someone who wasn't able to attend, we're gonna have this meeting recorded and then posted online onto our project website, and I'll send that out to y'all following the meeting. So for anything that you might have missed or someone might have missed, they can go back and listen to it. If y'all could try to stay muted during the presentations, we're a smaller group, so I think after a presentation, if y'all want to unmute and try to ask a question, I think with this size, we can try to do that. Or if you're more comfortable, you can write your question in the chat and then I'll go ahead and address it at the end of the presentations. We ask if you keep your video off. Well, the presenters can turn it on just to help with bandwidth if folks don't have strong internet connections, to hopefully have a good feed. And then again, if you could just go to the chat and make sure to sign in on the sign-in sheet when you have a chance, that'd be appreciated. So our main topics for today, we're gonna start off with a presentation from Mark Enders with the City of New Braunfels and Jessica Alderson with Parks and Wildlife, talking about discouraging wildlife feeding. I think this is a really interesting topic. I heard them give a presentation about it a couple months ago, and I think is something in this area that I've seen that might be of interest to y'all. And then after that presentation, I'll give you an update on where we stand with our watershed protection plan and some of the upcoming events that we hope to have virtually and maybe in person through the spring. And then any other lingering questions y'all have, we'll have a little bit of time to just have some open discussion. So with that, I'm gonna quickly stop sharing, and then Jessica, I'm gonna pass it over to you.
Okay, hi everyone. I will be so excited when we get to actually go back to being in person, because I enjoy giving presentations because I like being able to see everyone. And this kind of style is really challenging for me. So I'm super excited to talk with you guys today about some of the work that we've done with the new Braunfels protection plan. I've had the pleasure of working with Mark Enders and other staff in New Braunfels over the past couple of years. And so I'm really excited that you guys are going to be able to hear all the wonderful work that they've done. And I'm super proud of everything that they've done. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit. I'm an urban wildlife biologist for Parks and Wildlife. And so I am stationed out of San Antonio, out at Government Canyon State Natural Area. And so I mainly cover San Antonio and surrounding cities. And if basically any community that's having a challenge with either wildlife or natural resources, our office is there to help. So we do everything from public education to technical guidance to participating in policy, working with the city on sustainable development. So we do a lot of really cool different projects. And so I'll talk really quickly about some supplemental feeding issues. And so I'm not really sure, but I'm sure most of you guys probably are familiar with all the different urban deer issues that are going on across the state, especially here in San Antonio. And you guys may be facing some of those challenges with an overabundance of urban deer in your area as well. And so I know here in San Antonio and even up in the New Braunfels area, it's not uncommon to drive through communities and see, 20 to 40 deer hanging out in people's front yards. And so why do they do so well in urban environments? Well, they're highly reproductive. And most of you probably know or have seen for yourselves that it's very common for them to have twins and even sometimes triplets if we have a good year as far as habitat and rainfall goes. And so they are very highly reproductive. We've got a lot of habitat loss that's happening in the area as well. And so with all the construction that's going on in development, their natural habitat is being lost. So they've got to go somewhere. And lucky for them and unlucky for us, they adapt really well to the changing environment. And so they can live out at Government Canyon with 14,000 acres of natural land, or they can live right in your own neighborhood and feed off the landscape that you work so hard to keep nice and lush and green. So with those adaptations come some challenges when we're getting a lot of deer drawn into these smaller communities. Supplemental feeding tends to be a big issue that tends to draw wildlife into these more urban communities. And we'll talk a little bit about that in just a few minutes. Lack of predators. So what do you think the natural predator is in an urban environment for deer? It's going to be vehicles, right? And so we do have coyotes and bobcats that do pass through some of our more urban communities, but most of them are just going to be passing through, and they're not going to do a good enough job keeping those populations in check. So really, it's just vehicles. And then, of course, we typically don't have any type of hunting in an urban environment. So some of the challenges that we see when we have overabundant deer populations is we have injured deer. So you can see in the upper left-hand corner, we've got, this is very common for us to see very skinny deer. And I get this call all the time, you know, I'm feeding all of these deer and they're really skinny and I don't understand why. Well, most people that are feeding deer are not feeding food that is good for them. So it has no nutritional value for them. And then the fact that there are so many deer, 20, 40 deer hanging out in people's front yards, just an overabundance of deer, that makes it to where there's not a lot of resources, right? And so they are in closer nose-to-nose contact, which then exposes them to more disease risks as well. We see, especially in the hill country, we did some studies on deer that were in high density areas, and we were finding that they were just overloaded with parasites. And so a lot of times you'd see kind of diarrhea down the back end, and they just looked very, very unhealthy and very sickly. We normally would see some low levels of parasite loads in a wild deer population. However, when they get in these higher concentrations of deer in these smaller areas, they seem to spread those diseases and the parasites around a lot easier, and they're not very healthy. So their body is not able to naturally fight off the disease and or the parasites that they're currently dealing with. Deer vehicle collisions are a big, big concern, and I'm sure Mark's going to talk to you about the number of dead deer that they pick up every year, the large numbers of deer. And so deer vehicle collisions are very, very common in a lot of the areas, especially in the hill country. And, you know, it's not only damaging to our vehicles, but also damaging to the wildlife as well. And then again, supplemental feeding. So in these communities that I work with, I've seen everything from people pouring 40-pound bags of corn out on their driveways, to hand feeding, to actually having up actual feeders like you would see on a rural property. Landscape damage is probably the most common cause or issue that we get called about. People getting frustrated because there's so many deer in their community that they're eating everything that they can get their little mouths on. And so that's a big concern there. Water quality. So which is why myself and Mark are here to talk to you guys about, you know, the negative impacts that white-tailed deer and other wildlife can have on water quality. Hardware disease. So this photo up in the top right-hand corner is a deer that has a volleyball net caught up in its antlers. So we get lots of calls, especially around during the time of rut, where there are bucks that have gotten all kinds of things, everything from soccer goals to volleyball nets to buckets to Christmas lights that are all up entangled in their antlers because during rut, they're out there and they're rubbing their faces and their heads on everything, and they're marking their territory, and they're trying to get the velvet off. And when they're transforming from velvet to hard antler, and so they're just rubbing their heads on everything, which causes them to easily get tangled up in things. And then last but not least, we'll talk about disease. So the deer down on the bottom left is a deer that tested positive for chronic wasting disease. And chronic wasting disease is a serious disease that is fatal to the deer. It's very, very contagious, and we do have it in the state of Texas. We don't have it in this area or in your area at this time, but it's as close as Medina County. And initially, when our positives started popping up, they were in breeding facilities. So they were closed, contained communities of deer. Well, recently, over the last year and a half, we have had positives in Medina County and up in the Panhandle of free range roaming deer. And now we even have some in Kimball County and out in Del Rio, so that we're free range roaming deer. So this is a disease that is very concerning to us as a natural resource agency, and we're continuing to monitor that situation, and we're doing a CWD collection across the state so that we can try to figure out how this disease is spreading and how it's going to impact our overall white-tailed deer population. And then last but not least, Lyme disease. So that's not a disease that necessarily affects the deer themselves, but can affect people. And so it's not caused by the deer themselves. It's actually caused by the deer tick, but their primary host for the deer tick is a white-tailed deer or deer. And so you can assume that the more deer that you have in higher concentrations, the more possibility that you're going to be exposed to deer ticks that have the Lyme disease. So there is that increased risk there. So what do deer eat? Their primary food source is going to be forbs. So a lot of people think that deer eat grass because they see them constantly kind of grazing around in your front yard and at the ground level. But in all reality, less than 10% of their diet actually is grass. And so what they're actually eating is the forbs. So it's all the other wildflowers and other things that come up between those grass blades. So like wine cup and sunflower and dayflower, that's what they really like. Those are first choice foods for them. And then their second choice would be browse. And so they eat a lot of this because, the forbs are only offered, throughout the spring time and depending on how much rainfall and maybe not for very long. So they also their diet depends largely on browse species. So browse would be that mid-canopy story food source. So kidneywood, cedar elm, mulberry, those are the types of food sources that they like to eat. And then in the urban environment, their food source that they eat and they like to eat, but is not very good for them, is supplemental food. So in general, with supplementally feeding any wildlife species, it brings them into these higher concentrations where there's more nose-to-nose contact. They're eating where they're pooping, essentially, more nose-to-nose contact. And so those disease risks drastically increase. And so most of the time when people are feeding, they're doing it because they feel like, oh my goodness, they're here in this urban environment. We don't have a place for them to go. And so there's not a lot for them to eat. So we need to feed them. And so they're doing it out of the goodness of their hearts, not even realizing how detrimental it is actually to the deer themselves. So we've seen deer that have abscesses along their jawline. That photo in the previous few slides, that deer had some abscesses along her jawline. And that was from compaction. So basically she's eating all this corn and hard food that she's not typically supposed to be eating, and it causes cuts inside of her mouth. And then she ends up getting all the corn compacted in their jaw and causes an abscess and gets an infection. And so the most common thing that people feed is corn. Around here in San Antonio, they feed everything from Cheetos to tortillas to, anything off the table that they're wanting to throw out. They will feed to deer and they will eat it. And so that's the hard part, is that even though they'll eat it, it's not good for them. And so not only is it not healthy for them, but it also causes those higher concentrations and with the disease risk. So I've had people ask me, well, can we just feed them fruits and vegetables because that's going to be a healthier diet for them? Or can we feed them high protein feed? Because my friend out in the rural landscape, he feeds his deer protein feed and all of his deer look great. Well, the reason why his deer look great is because he's actually managing those deer. So he's most likely harvesting the deer. So here in an urban setting where there's no harvesting going on, there's an occasional deer that's hit by a car or dies of old age or of some type of a disease, it's not enough. And so those deer quickly become overpopulated. So in general, we recommend don't feed the wildlife. So even if you're feeding them healthy food, it still draws those deer in higher concentrations, which is not good for them. So I'll just talk really quickly about some management options in the urban area, because people always ask, well, what do we do if we have too many deer? And you can see this deer here in this photo. She's very, very skinny. This was a community that I worked with that had 1 deer per acre. Which is a lot of deer in their community. And so typically we recommend in the hill country area with healthy habitat and healthy deer herds, we see that good number be about 1 deer per 12 to 18 acres. So 1 deer per acre, you can see that is a lot. That's a lot of deer. So some non-lethal management options would be a feeding ordinance, which is one of the things that we typically recommend when we start working with a community that's dealing with urban deer. A feeding ordinance that prohibits the public from feeding wildlife or specifically deer. All wildlife would be great, like what the city of New Braunfels did, but if you need to do it just specific for deer, that is fine too. And so we can help with that by helping with the language of that. We can help with public education because that's very, very important. Fencing. So fencing is always an option, but just keep in mind that deer will cross over a fence and can jump over a fence as high as 6 feet. So fencing can be sometimes expensive depending on how big of an area you're wanting to fence off or keep the deer out of. Habitat modification is always kind of a funny thing to me, because yes, you can modify the habitat and plant deer resistant plants, but I will tell you that in harsh times, like when we're in drought, the deer will eat whatever they can put their mouths on. So even though there are lots of plants listed out there as deer resistant, the deer don't read those lists and they will eat them if they're hungry. Other deterrents. So I'm sure you've been to any type of nursery or, Home Depot or Lowe's, and you see these different product labels: deer be gone, rabbit be gone, squirrel be gone. And I will say that a lot of times those things are very temporary if they work at all. But if it's something that you're interested in trying to use, you absolutely can do that. And then the last option for non-lethal would be fertility control, which comes up a lot. So I will say that in Texas, there is no approved method for fertility control for white-tailed deer. The only way to be able to use fertility control in white-tailed deer in Texas is to go through a research permit, which is required through a university. So essentially, if your community wanted to do fertility control, they would talk to a university like A&M Kingsville or any other university that's interested in doing fertility control work, and they would apply for a research permit through Parks and Wildlife. Fertility control has been shown to be effective at managing the current population moving forward. So if you're already in a situation where you have too many deer, you have 1 deer per acre, and there's way too many deer, you're going to have to combine fertility control with some other management option to get that population in check. And then, oh, sorry, I forgot about this last one, the trap, transport, and transplant. So the T permit. So that is one that is a permit where you basically hire a private contractor and the deer are trapped, and then they're transported and transplanted or relocated essentially to an approved facility. And so basically this is, the facility has to be approved by a Parks and Wildlife biologist. They go on the site, they look at what the current pressures are of the habitat on that property and how many deer already exist on the property to determine how many deer that property can sustain without supplemental feeding. So with the T permit, you apply for the permit through Parks and Wildlife, but then a private individual is hired to remove those deer and relocate them. With that permit, it's challenging with almost 5 million white-tailed deer in the state of Texas. There's a lot of deer. So there's not very many landowners that have enough property to be able to move deer to them. So many times this option is quickly taken off the table because we're not able to find an approved facility to move the deer to. Now the facilities do not have to be high fenced. It can be low or high fenced. And then let's quickly talk about the lethal method. So the T permit, or the TTP permit, the trap, transport, and process, is probably the most common permit that is used with the constituents that I work with. And so simply they hire a contractor to trap the deer, and then they're processed and the meat is then donated to the local food banks. Individual hunting, organized hunting, like archery hunts or permitted sharpshooters, those are all also very valid lethal methods of control options in urban environments. However, there aren't any communities currently in Texas that are utilizing those, but those programs have been used very successfully in other states to manage urban deer populations. So let's quickly talk about the ducks and geese, if you're having issues with those. So same goes with ducks and geese. So I'm going to talk about supplemental feeding, and it goes across the board for all wildlife. So natural food sources for ducks and geese are going to be fish and snails, to crustaceans, to grass, to algae. There's plenty of stuff for them in the environment for them to eat that we don't need to be supplementally feeding them. Ducks and geese should not be eating chips and popcorn, bread, and or crackers, because again, it is not good for them. So it causes the same malnutrition issues that it causes in the white-tailed deer. It causes them also to be drawn into those smaller areas and higher concentrations, causing them to be overpopulated. They lose their natural fear of humans. How many of you have gone to a local pond in a neighborhood and the ducks just come from out of nowhere and the geese come from out of nowhere and they're chasing you down the street even if you don't have food, right? Dietary and nutritional problems leads to disease among the waterfowl because again, they're in those higher concentrations, so they're passing those diseases back and forth to one another. It severely degrades the habitat, having those large numbers of ducks and geese in these concentrated areas because they're constantly walking on the habitat, they're constantly defecating on the habitat, and that causes issues with habitat growth and then also water quality, right? And then it just disruption of the natural migratory patterns. So I don't know how many of you have seen, I know we're seeing it here in San Antonio. We saw it some up in New Braunfels with the black-bellied whistling ducks. We're seeing them year round here and they're not really migrating like they're supposed to. And so they get settled in and they're like, hey, I'm getting, free food and this is great habitat. So I'm going to hang out here. And so, and then they kind of get fatter over the years and it makes it more challenging for them to fly, right? And so then they're not able to migrate as easily. So with non-native duck management, it's super important to understand that native duck species are protected by the Migratory Bird Treaty Act. So when you're looking at non-native duck management, you really have to make sure you understand the difference between non-native ducks and geese and native ducks and geese and which are protected and which are not. So here's some of the common non-native ducks and geese that you would probably see most likely in a lot of your urban parks. African geese, gray-leg geese, Egyptian geese, hybrid mallards there. So it's a mallard. If you see a mallard ever with any type of white feathering, that's a hybridized mallard. So they ended up breeding with your typical park duck, your typical white park duck. Muscovies are not protected, and this crested duck, you see a lot of these guys too. And there's many, many more. So if you decide to move forward with a non-native duck management program, that's something that I can help you with identifying non-native versus native. So we make sure that we're only concentrating our management efforts on those non-native ducks. Now with Muscovy ducks, for removal of ducks and geese, with Muscovy ducks, there is a regulation that states that if you trap a Muscovy duck, it cannot be relocated because we do actually have a native species of Muscovy that occur only in 3 counties further down south from us. And they look very different than our typical park Muscovy ducks. And so, if you are trapping in those counties, then you can relocate, but other counties, they're asking that those animals be humanely euthanized. And we can talk a little bit more about that if needed later. So here's kind of a common theme that you see at these overpopulated duck areas or water features throughout the city. You can see the habitat is severely degraded. There's pretty much nothing there except for the trees, right? And you can see that the ducks are all kind of coming up towards me while I'm taking the picture. And there's a black belly whistling duck, a couple of them in that photo too. And so you see this very commonly. And then you see this angel wing, we call it. And basically this is a very good indication that these birds are severely malnourished because of all the supplemental feeding that they are getting. They're severely malnourished, and it causes the physical structure of their wings to change because of the malnourishment. So what we recommend is, again, a feeding ordinance that prohibits the feeding of all wildlife would be wonderful, like what the city of New Braunfels ended up doing. Or if you need to do it species specific, we can assist with that also. And we recommend the trapping and removal of all non-native duck species. And I will say that as a biologist, if you're going to trap a non-native species, my general recommendation would be to humanely euthanize that animal and not relocate it, because it is non-native and it's going to have those same challenges no matter where you relocate it. And especially if we're talking about water quality, because if you relocate it within the same watershed, you're really not doing anything but moving it out of one spot and putting it into another spot, but you're still having that negative impact on the watershed and water quality. The other option you can do is oil eggs with food grade oil. And again, you want to make sure that you're only oiling the eggs of non-native duck species and not protective migratory duck and geese species that we commonly see through Texas because we're in the central flyway zone. So again, don't feed the ducks, don't feed the wildlife. And I will turn it over to Mark, and then I'm guessing maybe we can, or do you want to do questions now, Claire, or do you want to turn it over to Mark and then we can do questions after his presentation?
I think let's turn it over to Mark, and then we can just do questions for both of y'all's presentations afterwards.
Okay, perfect. Why stop sharing?
All right, good morning, everyone. Hopefully everyone can hear me. I definitely appreciate the opportunity to present to you all on kind of the urban wildlife management measures that we've been implementing here in New Braunfels. And certainly thanks to Jessica for her presentation. She's been a great resource for the city as we kind of move through some of these, or I guess at least the planning for doing wildlife management here in New Braunfels. So she's an excellent resource. The information that she just shared, Jessica shared with our city council and at several public workshops that we had here in New Braunfels. So I definitely, I would encourage you to use her as a resource if y'all decide to move forward with some of these measures as part of your watershed protection plan.
Mark, really quick, it looks like you're in the presenter view again. So we might need to just quickly switch it to just the presentation view.
Okay.
Yeah, perfect.
All right, sorry about that. So I'm Mark Enders. I'm the Watershed Program Manager with the City of New Braunfels. So one of the programs under my purview is the Watershed Protection Plan that's being implemented for the Dry Comal Creek and Comal River watersheds. So we have, similar to, I believe, the Cibolo Creek, as we have, a bacteria impairment on both of those water bodies. So we are, of course, interested in implementing bacteria management measures throughout the watershed to try to get a handle on those bacteria levels in both of those water bodies. So, why are we doing urban wildlife management in New Braunfels? As I mentioned, water quality is at least for my programs and what I do here with the city, water quality was the biggest driver for me. But also as we began to kind of explore the other negative impacts of overabundant urban wildlife here in New Braunfels, we had a lot of deer and traffic collisions. Our animal control services tracks the number of dead deer that they collect along roadsides here in New Braunfels. And so you can see the data here. We have anywhere between 500 and 650 deer that are collected from the roadsides each year in New Braunfels. So it was helpful to have this data as we kind of went to the public and went to city council to kind of move forward some of these wildlife management initiatives here in New Braunfels. And I think these numbers were very surprising to folks and the amount of deer that are collected. The last negative impact that we shared with city council and the public as we move forward these efforts were wildlife health, and Jessica mentioned a little bit about that in her presentation on just the actual health impacts that are on our wildlife, feeding things like corn and bread and foods that aren't part of their regular diet. Some other data that we use to kind of talk to city council and to the public were bacteria source tracking analyses that we had. We conducted this analysis in 2013 and 2016. So we worked pretty closely with GBRA as well as Dr. Terry Gentry at Texas A&M to do these analyses. So basically, we did the analysis 2013 and 2016. The data from the BST is shown kind of in these pie charts on the slide here. And you can see that a large percentage of the bacteria contributions or sources in the Dry Comal Creek and Comal River were from wildlife sources. It has the breakdown here of the non-avian, which would be presumed to be deer, raccoons, rabbits, possums, any non-avian wildlife, and then a percentage also from avian wildlife. And so when we saw these BST data, also with kind of visual observations on what we were seeing on the ground, it made sense. Certainly in Landa Park, which is a very popular park here in New Braunfels, you've had pervasive wildlife feeding through the years, largely with duck populations and feeding in the park itself. So you would see, it wouldn't be uncommon to see up to several hundred, ducks and geese in the park at one time. It was very common to see folks feeding, something that happened almost routinely and continuously, I guess, over the, I would say, I know when I was a kid, 30 years ago, I was brought here and was feeding ducks and geese. So it's been something that's been going on a long time. You have those large populations of ducks and geese in the park, largely non-native. And so along with that, you would visually see excrement from those animals all along the kind of walk paths, all along the water's edge, and then also direct defecation in the water body. So we could actually see that source of bacteria pollution. With non-avian wildlife, certainly with white-tailed deer, there's a lot of neighborhoods in and around Land Lake and the Comal River where there is a lot of feeding of the white-tailed deer, largely people feeding corn. People even have automatic feeders in their front yard. So a lot of folks feeding, and then just very large white-tailed deer populations in those neighborhoods and then in and around Land Lake and within the Comal River watershed. So, taking all this information and then also working, again, with Jessica on helping us to present to City Council, we took, basically Jessica's recommendation on, first step being a wildlife feeding ordinance. So we took all this information to City Council. We had a workshop with City Council, and then also a couple informational sessions with not just City Council, but also with the public on the negative impacts of wildlife feeding, how it's affecting water quality, and the traffic information that we had on dead deer that were collected from the roadsides. So we took all this information to council, and we recommended basically a wildlife feeding ordinance that ultimately got passed through the New Braunfels City Council in 2018 and became effective in March 2019. So this ordinance basically prohibits wildlife feeding on both public and private property. So whether you're in Landa Park or a city park, or even in your front yard or backyard, it would prohibit that feeding. The first offense under this ordinance would be a warning, and then the second offense would be fines from $75 to $500. There were a few exceptions in the ordinance to feeding. One was just common bird feeders that are hung at least 5 feet from the ground surface that would presumably be out of reach of deer or other animals other than birds from reaching those feeders. And then there was also a hunting land permit exception, which essentially there's a few properties still within the New Braunfels city limits that are large enough that they do still allow hunting, and those folks can get a permit through our police department to hunt on those properties. And so if folks are feeding for the purposes of hunting, they can still do so and wouldn't be in violation of the ordinance. So enforcement of the ordinance is done primarily through city park rangers in our city parks, and then through our animal control and code compliance department in areas outside of city parks. Along with the ordinance, we did a big educational campaign, which was largely funded by the TCEQ and the EPA through our Watershed Protection Plan grant. So they funded the development and the construction of signage that we put up throughout the community, primarily in our parks, but also in other strategic locations where we knew feeding was prominent. So you can see a few examples here of the signage that we put up. Some of the signs were just more simple and straightforward. That just had the, basically just the insignia of, the no feeding wildlife that's seen here in the middle. So those smaller signs we put basically on picnic tables all through Landa Park. The larger signs were kind of more kiosk style that had a little more information about, the negative impacts on wildlife feeding. And again, this was all funded through the WPP implementation grant through the TCEQ. We've also been doing some active management of non-native waterfowl primarily in land and parks. So since 2018, we have been doing trapping of those non-native waterfowl, primarily the Egyptian geese, but also Muscovies and domesticated waterfowl. So we've trapped about 150 non-native ducks and geese. Primarily, I'd say 90% of those would be the Egyptian geese, and the rest of them, that 10% or so, would be the Muscovies and then other domesticated ducks. So we've been doing that since 2018. This effort is city funded. We were unable to get grant funding through EPA and TCEQ for any active management. So if it comes down to is trapping either deer or ducks, we were told that the implementation grants of the Watershed Protection Plan, the Clean Water Act grants, would not cover those activities. That said, we were able to get some grant funding to do egg coating of non-native waterfowl eggs. So Jessica mentioned a little bit about this in her presentation, but essentially we contract with a biologist that goes out and they basically put vegetable oil on non-native duck eggs and geese eggs within the park. So we've treated about close to 100 eggs in Land Park. Again, both of these efforts are really direct efforts to try to get a hold on those overabundant waterfowl populations here in Land Park. With our watershed protection plan, one thing that stakeholders felt was very important was to do widespread education and outreach. So we have a lot of our grant funding and our efforts focused in on doing education and outreach. So certainly when the ordinance went to city council, there was a lot of education that was done in the form of wildlife management workshops. Again, Jessica and Parks and Wildlife helped us out there on just kind of educating the community on the negative impacts of overabundant wildlife. So we did a few of those ahead of when the ordinance went into effect. And when we presented that to council, that way, we felt that educated population kind of reduces the amount of, kickback that you may get about passing an ordinance like this. And certainly we did have a lot of kickback on folks that did, support feeding and wanted to continue wildlife feeding here in New Braunfels. But again, this information ahead of time, the city council and the public kind of helped to hopefully change folks' minds or better understand why the city was implementing this wildlife feeding ordinance. And certainly around that same time when we were presenting to city council and doing these workshops, we had the local newspapers, the Herald Zeitung, that was interested in this ordinance and some of these efforts the city was implementing. So certainly we worked with them to get them information on the negative impacts of wildlife feeding and the ordinance that we were looking to pass. We also worked with the local New Braunfels radio station, KMBT, and they did some plugs on their radio stations about the ordinance and the workshops to help publicize those. We also have done, some infographics that we funded through the Watershed Protection Plan grant. You can see, I guess, at least one example here. So we basically use that funding to develop these infographics and these educational pieces that we published in the newspaper. And we also have a website that we use to present information on the Watershed Protection Plan in general, but on the wildlife feeding ordinance and the feeding initiatives, wildlife management initiatives. Here's a couple examples of some educational postcards and handouts that we, again, funded through the Watershed Protection Plan grant. So these pieces here, the postcards, we did a large mail out to folks in and around the New Braunfels area, but these postcards are also used by our park rangers to hand out to folks when they do catch folks that are feeding wildlife in the park. So I mentioned the first violation or the first offense under the ordinance would be a warning. So when we give that warning, we can hand out these postcards that, give some information about the ordinance. And then the flip side of this postcard has information on the negative impacts of wildlife feeding that include traffic accidents, wildlife health, and then also, the water quality impacts that we're seeing. So the door hanger is real similar to the postcard. The front basically is just kind of our campaign pitch, do not feed wildlife. And then on the back, it has the information on negative impacts of wildlife feeding. So when our animal control services get a complaint or a call or see folks feeding deer in their front yard, they can go and put this door hanger on their door if they're not home and not available to speak with at the time that we stop by. We also worked and just completed an educational video. This was also funded through the Watershed Protection Plan grant. So we worked with the local production studio here in New Braunfels. Indio Sante was the name of that company. And we basically filmed a 3-minute video about, it had a lot of information in there about wildlife feeding, but also had some information about non-point source pollution in general, pet waste management and, bacteria pollution through pet waste. And then also just some basic information about how non-point source pollution works, what a watershed is. So we finalized this video very recently, and we're actually getting it in the newspapers and I'm sorry, the local movie theater. So the Creekside Movie Theater here in New Braunfels, and then the Evo Theater there in Shirts will be showing this kind of as a preview to the movies in the movie theaters. We'll also be kicking this video out through Facebook and a couple other social media sites that the city has. So again, this is a great piece and an effective method to kind of get the word out about our watershed protection plan, and then about the negative impacts of feeding wildlife, and then proper pet waste management. Again, this was an idea that was put forward by the WPP stakeholders, and one that we, again, I think it's a great piece, especially now that our direct in-person education outreach activities have been somewhat limited. This is a way we can get the word out about the WPP and these initiatives, again, through the movie theaters and then through other social media outlets where we don't actually have to go and give presentations on this information. Prior to COVID, we were doing a lot of, education outreach events about, the watershed protection plan in general, but, also about our wildlife management initiatives. So we were doing a lot of school presentations. We were actually working with a couple school districts here in New Braunfels to, train the science curriculum or the science teachers on curriculum that they can kind of incorporate into their lesson plans. And then we did a lot of outreach at community events here in New Braunfels to try to make some plugs about the watershed protection plan and our initiatives. And with that, I'd be happy to answer any questions. And I guess if you have any questions for Jessica as well, I guess now would be the time. And certainly with any of the information that I covered, if y'all are looking to move forward with any of these initiatives as part of your watershed protection plan, certainly have a copy of the ordinance, examples of these materials, education outreach materials that we put forward. So certainly would like to share those with you, so you're not having to reinvent the wheel, and give you a start on things that you might want to consider using as part of your watershed protection plan. Thank you for your time, and be happy to answer any questions.
Great. Thank you, Mark and Jessica. So if anyone has any questions, y'all can either write it in the chat, or if we want, you can try unmuting and asking out loud as well. If there aren't any questions, then I'll make sure to include both of Jessica and Mark's contact information in our follow-up email, and their presentations have been recorded, so they'll be going on our project site too, so y'all can follow up with them afterwards as well. But I appreciate y'all both giving that presentation, and I think Mark gave a lot of great information about going into implementation and some of the projects they've been doing on implementation, and that's going to be important for us as we're moving forward in this watershed protection
Claire,
process. Yes.
I had a quick question for Mark. Have you had time to see whether there's been any changes in the number of deer mortalities since the implementation?
We're continuing to track the data, on the amount of deer collected. We did see, I guess, with the 2019 data, we did see a decrease. But certainly the feeding ordinance, you know, all that stuff, and something to remind stakeholders or the community is that this stuff takes time to realize. You know, we did see that drop in traffic numbers by about 100 or so, or I think it was 150 deer collected. So we saw a decrease there, but I wouldn't be comfortable saying that that's kind of a direct result of the feeding ordinance. You know, I'd like to think so, but I think there's a lot of other factors that kind of play into that. So, you know, I think with, you know, an ordinance or any kind of initiatives that you're implementing, you know, either whether it's water quality or traffic accidents or anything that you are measuring, it will take some time for, you know, those actions to realize. And with the feeding ordinance, and Jessica would probably agree, as that, you know, folks stop feeding and then it would take, you know, the animals some time to kind of not get used to the feeding and then start to disperse, you know, to other areas to find food.
Yeah, totally. I agree.
Anything else? If not, I'll quickly start sharing my screen, but feel free if anyone else has any other questions to give a shout. So now I want to kind of give everyone an update on where we are in the watershed protection planning process. So I know it's been a while since we've met as a group. So just kind of doing some really quick background for the mid and lower Cibolo Creek. This is our watershed boundary. So it's going through parts of Bear, Guadalupe, Carnes, Wilson, and a little bit of Comal County. And bacteria is kind of the main impairment that we're looking at improving in the watershed, as well as some elevated levels of nutrients. So we've been working on this watershed protection plan. I think our first meetings were back in late 2017, but we're looking to address those water quality impairments, that bacteria and those nutrient levels, with the goal to improve or restore water quality within the watershed. And that, just as a reminder, so kind of all of those strategies and things that we talked about and we put into the plan, those were all voluntary. So that's why we really relied on y'all's support as our stakeholder group to give us information on what we think would be popular in the watershed that might be successful in implementation. And so kind of the key elements we focused on in the plan was identifying those sources of bacteria, estimating our load reductions, writing those descriptions of management measures, and I'll go through and refresh everyone on what those management measures were, discuss kind of the need for some education and outreach in the area, general schedule for implementation of these strategies, milestones we'll use to see if we're hitting our water quality targets, just some general estimates on what some of the financial costs if we were going to be implementing these strategies in the plan, how we're going to measure success, and then just continued monitoring so we can see these changes in water quality and in the watershed as we go through this implementation process. So where we last left off was we had finished off our draft of the watershed protection plan at the last meeting, and we were going to be sending it on to review. So it's gone through review at the Texas State Soil and Water Conservation Board, the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality, and with the EPA, Environmental Protection Agency. And just this past August, we did get final acceptance from EPA. So that's great news for us. And I thank y'all for your continued participation and support as we were going through that planning and going through those review process, getting this plan over the finish line. So I'm just going to quickly show y'all on the website. So the last time y'all saw it, it was just in a Word document, but we've recently been formatting it. And so we have it now in a PDF format. So it's got a lot more pictures, so just better appeal and kind of clickable through. So if you go onto our project website, here, so cibolo.tamu.edu, you'll see here in the sidebar, the Mid and Lower Cibolo Creek Watershed Protection Plan. So you can click on that. And that's going to pull up the final version of this watershed protection plan that was accepted, and you can go down and be able to kind of click through to a different section and be able to kind of refresh on all those different sections of the plan. Right now, since it's virtual, our eventual goal is we do want to get these printed out and distributed to all of y'all that worked so hard getting this plan together. So our hope is in the spring at some of our upcoming meetings, we'll be able to have it in person and distribute these. If not, then we'll try to drop it off at the local river authorities and county extension offices. And then if y'all want, you could go to one of those offices and be able to pick it up. So I'll definitely keep you all updated on how we're going to be handing out those printed copies. But so I think with Mark's presentation talking about some of the funding that they've done in New Braunfels on the Comal River for implementation with those educational signage and promotional videos. So now that they've moved from planning to implementation, you can start seeing some of the projects that they've started, and hopefully that helps us get energized, because now we're going to be moving from this planning process into the implementation process. So I just kind of want to refresh people with what our management measures were, because that's going to help guide us on some implementation projects and strategies we may want to start and move forward with now that we're going into the next stage. So our first one was developing water quality management plans or conservation plans. So this was really for landowners working to improve different things on their own property. So working with the NRCS or and coming up with conservation plans for their properties that can help improve water quality. And our hope is over the next 10 years to do roughly around 40 of those. We also want to work with feral hog control. So a lot of that is doing some education and outreach on proper trapping or management of feral hog populations, as well as maybe also doing some fencing. So a lot of this is for educational purposes on how we can manage these feral hog populations to help reduce some of that. Identifying and repairing or replacing failing on-site sewage systems. So we can look at identifying, inspecting, repairing, and replacing these septic systems, and then also being able to educate homeowners on proper maintenance. We had that educational program this past January talking about maintenance of septic systems, and that's something we're looking within the next couple years to bring back and maybe do the longer full day program for folks in the watershed to learn how to maintain these systems. Increase proper pet waste management. Pet waste was one of the key things we wanted to work on, and we saw was a big contributor to bacteria in the watershed. So a lot of that, again, is education and outreach and installing and maintaining pet waste stations in public areas. We also talked about maybe looking at trying to work with HOAs and putting it on in apartment complexes or other neighborhoods instead of just in public parks where they were already quite a few are installed. Implementing and expanding urban and impervious surface stormwater runoff management. So this is more for that mid-Cibolo where there's the more urban areas. There were talks in certain cities about installing some green stormwater infrastructure to be able to kind of reduce the amount of runoff, stormwater runoff. So looking at doing either demonstration sites or doing restoration or actual implementation of stormwater infrastructure, working in those areas to get that identified and installed where appropriate. Managing sanitary sewer overflows and unauthorized discharges. So that's more with wastewater treatment facilities. Just if there's any failing or old infrastructure, looking at repairing and replacing that. And a lot of that is also with education and outreach for those homeowners that are hooked up to the septic, to the wastewater treatment facilities, just knowing what they can and cannot dump down their drain. So, making sure that they're disposing of those fats, oils, and grease, things that are not supposed to be flushed down toilets. making sure they know that so they're not putting an added strain on those wastewater treatment facilities that might cause those overflows. And then planning and implementation of wastewater reuse. This was another thing from wastewater treatment facilities that was identified as something they were interested in, and being able to do more reuse, possibly for irrigation on public parks using that gray water. So kind of looking and talking and seeing where that might be something that can be implemented throughout the watershed. And then the last one was reducing illicit dumping. So again, that's a lot of educational signage on some of those road crossings and bridges where we see a lot of people tossing things over into the creek, but also increasing the amount of waste collection events to encourage folks to wait and dispose of it at those collection events instead of just tossing it over a bridge to get rid of it. So trying to increase that to annually around the watershed. So those are kind of the idea. So I encourage, if you're a landowner or in a city and you're interested in exploring some of those, as we mentioned, having this watershed protection plan be accepted by the EPA opens up additional funding revenues. And Mark mentioned that in his presentation, they were able to get some funding from some 319 to be able to offset the costs of some of these implementation projects that they did. So feel free to reach out to me or Patty, and we can work with y'all to see if we could identify possible funding streams to help offset some of those costs and implement some of these strategies. I know in our planning phases, we sometimes got a little restless. It was a lot of talk and we weren't doing a lot of action, and now we can kind of move to that more active phase of doing implementation. So definitely we'll be keeping the conversation going with some of y'all to how we can start implementing this plan. So for the near term, our next steps is we want to be able to print and distribute those copies of our accepted WPP. So as I mentioned, we'll hopefully try to bring it to upcoming meetings, or if anything else, be able to drop it off at some local sites and then let you all know if you want to be able to pick it up. We're going to print off lots of copies, so there should be enough for y'all to take one or two if you want to pass it around to friends or neighboring landowners. That identifying your areas for watershed protection plan implementation around the watershed. Also, you heard in a lot of those management measures that education and outreach were a big component of it. So we do have a couple educational events that are coming up in the watershed. So I do want to quickly let you know about those opportunities. The first one, we're doing a Texas riparian and stream ecosystem training. So this is going to be online, and it's a little bit different of a setup. It's you pre-recorded videos that you watch on your own, and then you join on December 8th between 10 a.m. to noon for a live discussion with the instructors where you can ask questions and ask advice if you have something you have a burning question on your own property. And then we also are doing a Healthy Lawn, Healthy Waters program. And so this one is in March. So we're hoping by March it's going to be in person. They are targeting the San Antonio area as well as Mid and Lower Cibolo Creek. So it's most likely going to be in the city of San Antonio, but not a terribly long drive for y'all. Or if in March, unfortunately, we still won't be able to host in person, then it will be online. And I just want to quickly show y'all. So I'm going to post the links to these. So this is the Healthy Lawns and Healthy Waters. And if you are interested in these events, you can register online. Both of them are free, whether it's going to be in person or online. Okay, I think I might have to, and then this is the one for the Texas Riparian and Stream online. Again, you've got the RSVP right here. So I'm gonna quickly stop sharing because I'm having trouble putting it in the chat while I'm sharing. So those are the two events. I'll also include those links to RSVP in our follow-up email. And I'll put those on our website as well too. So I encourage y'all to come out to those, and then hopefully we'll be able to do another stakeholder meeting here in the spring in person. I'd love to see y'all in person. That is kind of all I had. Let me quickly share my screen so you have all our contact information. So that's really all I had as big updates. So here's our contact information. I'm still working mostly remotely. It seems like it's going to be through the end of the year. So email is definitely the easiest way to get a hold of me. And then if you prefer phone, I can call you on my cell, or we could set up a Zoom or a Teams meeting. And then again, here's our project website, cibolo.tamu.edu. So that's where everything's going to be updated afterwards. And if anyone has any questions or comments, feel free to unmute or write it in the chat. Yeah. Let me just quickly share the Healthy Lawns link again. Okay, if there's nothing else, then I thank y'all for joining us. I will get this information compiled and sent out to y'all following the meeting, hopefully a little bit later today, if not tomorrow morning. And hopefully I'll be talking to y'all in person soon.